My name is Whitney, and I'm 29 years old. Right now, I'm standing outside my parents' house on New Year's Eve, my hands trembling as I stare at the notification on my phone showing a wire transfer of $1.2 billion. 3 years ago, they threw me out of this very door because I refused to marry their business partner's son. Now my startup has just been acquired and everything has changed. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you believe family should love you for who you are, not what you can give them. This story might change how you see everything. Growing up in the Harrison household meant living by one simple rule, which was that appearances mattered more than anything else. My father, Harold, built his construction company from the ground up over 30 years, turning it into a moderately successful business worth about $20 million. He wore his success like armor, constantly reminding us that everything we had came from his hard work and sacrifice. My mother, Patricia, had given up her nursing career when Kevin was born, transforming herself into the perfect corporate wife who organized charity galas and country club luncheons with surgical precision. Our house in Westchester looked like something from an architecture magazine, with its circular driveway and perfectly manicured hedges that Patricia supervised personally. Every room had been decorated by an interior designer she'd found through her tennis club connections, and family photos were arranged strategically to show our perfect family at various milestones. Kevin, my younger brother by 2 years, had followed the path laid out for him, without question going to law school at Georgetown and joining a prestigious firm downtown. Jennifer, the baby of the family at 24, had just finished her medical residency at Johns Hopkins, making Harold beam with pride whenever he mentioned his daughter, the doctor, to his golf buddies. Then there was me, the middle child who never quite fit the mold. While Kevin was getting his acceptance letter to law school, I was in my dorm room at MIT coding until 4 a.m. on projects that made my eyes burn but filled my heart with excitement. I remember calling home to share my joy about getting into one of the most prestigious computer science programs in the country, only to have Harold ask why I couldn't have chosen Harvard Business School like the daughter of his friend Richard. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science and artificial intelligence, my family didn't attend the ceremony because it coincided with Kevin's birthday celebration at the country club. The pressure started when I turned 25 and remained stubbornly single while working at a tech startup in the city. Patricia would call me every Sunday not to ask about my work or my life, but to remind me that my biological clock was ticking and that Brandon Sheffield had asked about me again. Brandon was the son of my father's most important business partner, a man who controlled several major contracts that kept Harold's company profitable. He was 32, conventionally handsome in that prep school way, with his perfectly styled blonde hair and custom suits, and he managed his father's real estate portfolio with the kind of aggressive confidence that made other men admire him. What they didn't see was the way Brandon talked over me at every dinner, explaining my own job to me as if I couldn't possibly understand technology despite my MIT degree. They didn't notice how he would put his hand on my lower back possessively when we walked into restaurants, or how he'd order for me without asking what I wanted. During one particularly awful double date with his friends, he actually told them that it was cute how I played with computers, but that I'd obviously give it up once we had children. When I corrected him, saying I had no intention of giving up my career, he laughed and patted my hand like I was a child having a tantrum. The worst part was that my family saw all of this and thought it was charming. Harold would chuckle when Brandon interrupted me at dinner, calling it assertive. Patricia would smile approvingly when Brandon mentioned wanting 4 children, already planning how she'd help decorate the nursery. Kevin joked that Brandon could keep me in line, while Jennifer said I should be grateful that someone so successful was interested in me, despite my tendency to be difficult. Everything came to a head on a Thursday evening in early December 3 years ago. Harold had arranged a dinner at Le Bernardin, the kind of restaurant where the waiters pull out your chair and the wine costs more than most people's rent. Both families were there, the Sheffields and the Harrisons, arranged around a private table in a room with soft lighting and fresh orchids. I knew something was planned when I saw Patricia wearing her diamond necklace, the one she only brought out for the most important occasions. The dinner progressed with the usual small talk about business and vacation homes, until Brandon suddenly stood up his chair, scraping against the hardwood floor. My stomach dropped as he reached into his jacket pocket, and sure enough, out came a small velvet box. The speech he gave was exactly what you'd expect, all about how I'd make the perfect wife and mother, how our families were meant to be joined, how he'd take care of me so I wouldn't have to worry about working anymore. He actually said those words that I wouldn't have to worry about working, as if my career was some kind of burden he was gallantly offering to remove. When he dropped to one knee and opened the box to reveal a massive diamond ring that looked more like a paperweight than jewelry, everyone around the table was beaming except me. I looked at my mother's expectant face, my father's satisfied smile, and Brandon's confident smirk, and I knew that saying yes would mean disappearing into a life that would slowly suffocate everything I was. So I said no. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just a quiet but firm no thank you. I couldn't accept his proposal. The silence that followed my refusal felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only seconds before Harold's face turned a shade of purple I'd never seen before. Brandon stood up slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to humiliation to rage in quick succession. He shoved the ring box back into his pocket so violently that he knocked over a water glass, sending ice cubes scattering across the white tablecloth. His father, Richard Sheffield, stood up and looked at Harold with an expression that could have frozen hell itself, saying only that this would have consequences for their business relationship before leading his family out of the private dining room. The ride home was suffocating in its silence, with Patricia crying quietly in the front seat while Harold gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. Kevin and Jennifer sat on either side of me in the back seat, both of them leaning away as if my rejection of Brandon was somehow contagious. When we pulled into the driveway, Harold finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous, telling me to pack my things because I was no longer welcome in his house. I thought he was being dramatic, that he'd calm down by morning, but when I came downstairs with a cup of coffee the next day, my suitcases were already by the front door. Harold was in his study with Richard Sheffield, and through the partially open door, I could hear Richard saying that their $50 million joint venture was off unless Harold could guarantee Brandon wouldn't be humiliated further by having to see me at family functions. That's when I understood that my own father was choosing a business deal over his daughter. Patricia wouldn't even look at me as I tried to explain that I couldn't marry someone who didn't respect me, who saw me as an accessory to his life rather than a partner. She just kept folding and refolding a dish towel, muttering about how I'd destroyed everything they'd worked for. Kevin came out of his room long enough to tell me that I was selfish and ungrateful, that Brandon was offering me a life most women would kill for. Jennifer, home from her hospital rotation, shook her head and said I always had to be different, always had to make everything difficult. Within 3 hours of that failed proposal, I was standing on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, watching my childhood home disappear in the rearview mirror of an Uber. The driver kept glancing at me in the mirror, probably wondering why a well-dressed woman was crying silently in his back seat at 10 in the morning. I gave him the address of a cheap hotel in Queens, knowing my savings account had about $8,000 that would have to last until I figured out what came next. The studio apartment I eventually found in Brooklyn was a far cry from my childhood bedroom with its walk-in closet and ensuite bathroom. 600 square feet with a Murphy bed, a kitchenette that was really just a hot plate and mini fridge and a view of a brick wall. But it was mine, paid for with my own money from freelance coding projects I picked up to stretch my savings. I set up my laptop on a card table I bought from a thrift store and started working on the idea that had been burning in the back of my mind for years. Those first few months were the loneliest of my life. I tried calling my parents, but Harold had blocked my number. Emails bounced back with automated messages saying the addresses didn't exist. When I went to Harold's office building to try to see him in person, the security guard, someone who'd known me since I was 12, looked at me with pity and said he had strict instructions not to let me pass the lobby. Even our family lawyer, whom I'd known my whole life, sent a formal letter stating that I should cease all attempts at contact. Thanksgiving came and went with me, eating Chinese takeout alone, while scrolling through Patricia's Facebook posts about what a blessing family was. She'd posted a photo of the dining room table set for dinner, and I could count the place settings, one for each family member except me. It was like I'd been photoshopped out of their lives as cleanly as if I'd never existed. Christmas was even worse, because Jennifer posted an Instagram story of them all laughing around the tree, and in the background, I could see that my stocking had been removed from the mantel. But something shifted in me during those cold, lonely months. The pain transformed into determination, and I threw myself into developing my application with a focus that bordered on obsession. 18-hour days became normal, with breaks only for instant ramen and walks around the block to clear my head. The concept was sophisticated, but simple in its goal, using artificial intelligence to analyze medical imaging and detect early-stage cancers that human eyes might miss. The breakthrough came when I met Sarah Chen at a Women in Tech meetup in Manhattan. She was 15 years older than me, a former Google executive who'd cashed out and become an angel investor focused on female founders. Unlike the dozen male investors who'd already rejected me with barely concealed condescension, Sarah actually listened to my pitch. She asked hard questions about the algorithm, the training data, the potential for false positives, and I could see her getting more interested with each answer. Sarah didn't just invest the initial $100,000 I desperately needed. She became my mentor and eventually my closest friend. She introduced me to other investors, helped me navigate the brutal world of startup politics, and talked me through the nights when I wanted to give up. We worked out of a shared workspace in Brooklyn at first, just me and 2 developers I'd convinced to join me for equity since I couldn't afford salaries. The technical challenges were immense, and there were weeks when I thought we'd never solve them. Training the AI required massive amounts of medical imaging data, which meant convincing hospitals to partner with us when we had no track record. The algorithm had to be sophisticated enough to detect anomalies, but not so sensitive that it flagged every benign variation. We went through 17 iterations before achieving the accuracy rates that would make doctors take us seriously. When we finally hit 97% accuracy in detecting early-stage pancreatic cancer, something that killed most patients because it was usually found too late, Sarah actually cried. We both knew this wasn't just a successful startup anymore. It was something that could save thousands of lives. The head of oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering personally called to discuss a pilot program, and suddenly everyone who'd dismissed me wanted meetings. The company grew faster than I could have imagined, and within 12 months, we went from 3 people crammed around a folding table to 50 employees in a real office space in Manhattan with actual walls and a conference room that didn't double as a storage closet. The validation felt surreal after so many months of rejection and struggle. We hired brilliant engineers from Stanford and MIT data scientists who'd worked at DeepMind and medical consultants who believed in our vision of democratizing early cancer detection. Being named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list should have been one of the happiest moments of my life, and professionally it was. The magazine did a full spread with a photo shoot in our office, featuring me standing in front of our wall of patient testimonials letters from people whose cancers we'd helped detect early enough to treat successfully. The headline read, "The MIT dropout who could save 1 million lives," which wasn't entirely accurate since I'd graduated, but it made for a better story. The morning the article went live, our website crashed from the traffic and my LinkedIn inbox exploded with congratulations from everyone except the people I'd once hoped would be proud of me. I knew my family must have seen it, because Harold's company had a public relations firm that monitored all media mentions of anyone connected to the business. Jennifer worked at a hospital where our technology was being tested, so there was no way she hadn't heard about it. But there was only silence from them, a void where family celebration should have been. Sarah threw me a surprise party at the office, and my employees cheered and popped champagne, but I excused myself to cry in the bathroom because none of the people who'd raised me had even sent a text. 3 weeks later, I made one more attempt at reconciliation. We were having our official product launch, a huge event at the Rainbow Room with investors, medical professionals, and press from around the world. I sent formal invitations to my parents' house, to Kevin's law firm, to Jennifer's hospital, carefully written in professional language that didn't betray how much I wanted them there. The RSVPs never came, and on the night of the launch, as I stood at the podium looking out at 300 faces, none of them belonged to my family. Instead, I learned from a mutual acquaintance that on the same evening, my entire family had attended Brandon Sheffield's wedding to a senator's daughter at the Plaza Hotel. The photos were all over the New York Times style section the next day, and there were my parents beaming in the receiving line as if Brandon were their own son. Patricia was quoted saying how wonderful it was to see young people making traditional choices which felt like a knife twisted specifically for me. Kevin had been a groomsman, Jennifer a guest of honor, and in every photo, they looked like the perfect family, minus one daughter. The cognitive dissonance of my professional success and personal rejection was devastating. During the day, I was fielding calls from venture capitalists, wanting to invest millions speaking at medical conferences about the future of AI in healthcare, and watching our user base grow exponentially. But at night, I'd scroll through my family's social media, torturing myself with images of Sunday dinners I wasn't invited to and family vacations I'd never take. Patricia had even cropped me out of old photos, creating a revisionist history where I'd never existed. 6 months after the Forbes article, I accidentally ran into my mother at Bergdorf Goodman while shopping for a dress for another awards ceremony. I saw her before she saw me, standing at the cosmetics counter testing lipsticks with the same critical eye she'd once used to inspect my appearance before school dances. For a moment, I considered just leaving, but something made me walk over and say hello. She looked right through me, literally turned her head and looked past me as if I were invisible, then told the sales associate she was ready to check out and walked away without acknowledging my existence. That night, Jennifer called me for the first time since I'd been thrown out, but not to apologize or reconcile. She wanted to tell me how dare I ambush our mother in public, how I was clearly trying to manipulate the situation for sympathy. When I tried to explain that I'd simply said hello, she cut me off with a laugh that sounded exactly like Patricia's and said I'd always been dramatic, always needed to be the center of attention, and that's why I'd destroyed our family. She suggested I get therapy for my narcissism before hanging up. The irony was that while my biological family treated me like a pariah, I was building something that would help millions of families stay together longer. Our AI had evolved beyond just cancer detection to predicting strokes and heart attacks, with enough warning for preventive treatment. We partnered with insurance companies to make the technology accessible to lower-income patients, and the testimonials poured in daily from people whose lives we'd saved. A little girl in Oklahoma got to see her mother beat breast cancer because we caught it at a stage 1. An elderly man in Florida survived a massive stroke because our algorithm detected the warning signs 3 days early. The work became my salvation and my identity. Every success was proof that I'd been right to choose my own path, that I had value beyond being someone's wife or my father's bargaining chip. But even as the company valuation climbed past $100 million, then $500 million, there was an emptiness that no amount of professional achievement could fill. I'd dream about Patricia teaching me to bake cookies and wake up to remember she'd erased me from her life. I'd see fathers and daughters having lunch in Manhattan and have to look away. On the morning of December 31st, 3 years after that disastrous proposal dinner, I arrived at our company headquarters at 7 a.m. as usual, but the energy in the building was different, electric, with anticipation. Sarah was already there, which was unusual since she typically worked from home, and she had that expression that meant something significant was happening. Before I could even set down my coffee, she ushered me into the conference room, where 3 people in expensive suits were waiting with documents spread across the table. Mark Thompson, the CEO of MedTech Global, the largest medical technology conglomerate in the world, stood up and shook my hand with the kind of grip that meant serious business was about to be discussed. His company was worth over $300 billion and had been watching our progress with what he called intense interest. They wanted to acquire us, not just for our technology, but for our team, our vision, and most importantly, they wanted me to stay on as CEO of the new AI division with complete autonomy and 40% equity in the merged entity. The number they offered made my breath catch in my throat. $1.2 billion, not billion. Sarah had to repeat it 3 times before it actually registered in my brain. They'd done their due diligence, analysed our growth trajectory, and concluded we were worth every penny given our potential to revolutionise preventive medicine globally. Mark explained that with their resources and distribution network, we could deploy our technology in every major hospital within 2 years, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of lives annually. The negotiations took 6 hours with lawyers conferring over every clause and condition, but by 2 p.m, we had a deal. The wire transfer would be completed by 5 p.m, and announcements would go out to the press after the markets closed. My employees would all receive substantial payouts from their equity stakes, with several of them becoming millionaires overnight. Sarah hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering that she was so proud of what I'd built from nothing but determination and brilliance. As the news spread through the office, the celebration was immediate and overwhelming. Developers who'd worked 60-hour weeks for equity instead of market salaries were crying and calling their families. The young woman I'd hired as our first intern, now our head of operations, collapsed into a chair when she calculated what her shares were worth. Pizza and champagne materialized from somewhere, and someone connected their phone to the speakers, filling the office with music that probably violated several lease agreements about noise levels. But even in the midst of the celebration, surrounded by people who'd believed in me when my own family wouldn't, I felt the familiar ache of absence. This was the kind of moment you were supposed to share with your parents, the kind of achievement that should have had Harold bragging to everyone at the country club. Instead, I stood on the terrace of our 32nd floor office, looking out at the city lights starting to twinkle in the early winter sunset, and felt profoundly alone, despite being surrounded by joy. By 6 p.m., the wire transfer was complete, and the notification on my phone showing the balance in my account looked like a typo, all those zeros that couldn't possibly be real. The press release had gone out, and my phone was exploding with messages from journalists, competitors, and people I hadn't heard from since college, suddenly remembering we were best friends. But nothing from Westchester, nothing from the people whose approval I'd once wanted more than anything. As evening approached and my employees started leaving for their own New Year's Eve celebrations, Sarah invited me to join her family's party on Long Island. Her parents treated me like a daughter, and her kids called me Aunt Whitney, but I politely declined. Something was pulling me back to Westchester. Maybe closure, maybe hope, or maybe just the human need to share monumental news with the people who'd shaped you, even if they'd shaped you through rejection. The drive from Manhattan to my parents' house took 45 minutes, though it felt simultaneously like seconds and hours. Every mile brought back memories of this same route in reverse heading into the city for shopping trips with Patricia, where she'd critique my appearance the entire way, or driving with Harold to his office during school breaks, where he'd lecture me about the importance of connections over competence. The familiar exit sign for Westchester made my chest tight with anxiety and anticipation. When I turned onto their street, I could see cars lining the driveway and spilling onto the road, recognizable vehicles belonging to family friends and Harold's business associates. Through the massive windows Patricia had insisted on, despite the heating costs, I could see the party in full swing, people in cocktail dresses and suits holding champagne floats, while caterers in black uniforms circulated with trays of food that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. The Christmas decorations were still up, white lights wrapped around every tree and pillar in a display of elegant excess. I parked across the street and sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching the life I'd been excluded from continue without me. There was Kevin gesturing animatedly while telling some story that had his audience laughing. Jennifer was by the piano with her new boyfriend, a surgical resident Patricia had mentioned approving of in one of her Facebook posts. And there were my parents hosting and orchestrating, like they always did, Harold commanding the room, while Patricia ensured every detail was perfect. The decision to get out of the car and walk to the door felt like jumping off a cliff, that moment of commitment, when gravity takes over and there's no going back. My hands were shaking as I rang the doorbell, hearing it echo through the house over the party noise. Through the frosted glass panel, I saw a figure approaching, and when the door opened, Kevin stood there with a champagne flute in one hand and his mouth falling open in shock. For a moment, we just stared at each other, 3 years of silence, creating a chasm that felt impossible to cross. He looked older, a few grey hairs at his temples that hadn't been there before, and his expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and then hardened into the family party line. Without saying a word, he turned and called for Harold, his voice carrying over the music and conversation in a way that made several heads turn toward the foyer. Harold appeared within seconds, Patricia close behind him, and the look on his face when he saw me standing on his doorstep was one I'll never forget. It wasn't anger or surprise, but a kind of cold dismissal, like I was a door-to-door salesperson interrupting his evening. He didn't step aside to let me in, didn't even acknowledge me as his daughter, just stood there, in his expensive suit, with his arms crossed, and waited for me to speak. The words I'd rehearsed in the car disappeared, and instead I heard myself saying that I just wanted to wish them a happy new year, that I didn't need anything from them anymore, but I thought they should know I'd been successful, more successful than they could have imagined. Harold's expression didn't change, and he started to close the door, but Patricia grabbed his arm and whispered something urgently in his ear, while staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The silence stretched between us as Patricia continued whispering urgently to Harold, her eyes never leaving my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Behind them, party guests were starting to notice the drama at the door, conversations dying as people craned their necks to see who could possibly be causing Harold Harrison to look so coldly furious on New Year's Eve. Kevin had disappeared back into the crowd, but I could see Jennifer pushing through the guests, her face flushed with indignation when she recognized me. Before anyone could speak, I turned and walked back toward my car, my heels clicking on the icy driveway, with a finality that felt like the last page of a chapter I'd been trying to close for 3 years. Behind me, I heard Harold's voice not calling me back, but telling Patricia to close the door and return to their guests. The dismissal was so casual, so effortless, as if I were nothing more than an unwanted delivery they could simply refuse to accept. By the time I reached my office building, it was nearly 11 p.m, and the security guard looked surprised to see me back. The executive floor was empty, except for the cleaning crew, who nodded politely as I made my way to the conference room where we'd signed the papers that morning. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city preparing for midnight. Groups of people bundled against the cold, making their way to viewing spots for fireworks. Couples holding hands, families huddled together for warmth and celebration. I pulled out my phone to check the time and saw 17 missed calls from Kevin, which was strange since he'd shown no interest in talking to me for 3 years. Then the texts started coming through. First from him, then from Jennifer, all variations of the same urgent question about whether the news was true, whether the reports they were seeing online were real. Apparently someone at the party had Googled my name after my unexpected appearance, and the acquisition announcement was trending on every business news site. The phone rang again, Kevin's name flashing on the screen, and this time I answered. His voice was different from the cold dismissal at the door, now pitched high with barely controlled panic. He was speaking so fast I could barely understand him, something about Dad needing to talk to me urgently about misunderstandings that needed to be cleared up immediately. In the background, I could hear the party noise had changed from celebration to agitated conversation, Harold's voice rising above the rest, demanding to know why no one had told him about this sooner. Then Harold's voice was on the phone, and the transformation was so complete, it would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. Gone was the ice-cold dismissal from an hour ago, replaced by a warm, fatherly tone I hadn't heard since before I'd refused Brandon's proposal. He was calling me sweetheart, saying there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that of course I was welcome home for New Year's, that family was family no matter what happened. The words were right, but the timing told me everything I needed to know about their sincerity. When he finally got to the point asking if it was true about the acquisition, about the $1.2 billion, I simply said yes, it was true, all of it. The silence on his end was deafening, and I could practically hear him recalculating my value in his head, transforming me from the ungrateful daughter who'd cost him a business deal to an asset worth more than he'd ever dreamed of accumulating. When he spoke again, his voice was trembling with an emotion that had nothing to do with paternal pride and everything to do with greed. He started talking about family legacy, about how he'd always known I was special, how the Harrison name meant something and we needed to stick together. Patricia grabbed the phone from him, her voice breaking with tears, that I'm sure she thought sounded genuine, sobbing about how she'd never stopped loving me, how she'd kept my room exactly the same, how she'd prayed every night for my return. The lies were so transparent, I actually laughed, which seemed to shock them into momentary silence. Jennifer took the phone next, her tone softer than it had been in years, talking about sisterly bonds, and how she'd always admired my independence, conveniently forgetting the cruel voicemail she'd left just 6 months ago. She mentioned that she was starting a medical research project that could really use funding, just a few $1 million, that would be nothing to me now, but would mean everything to childhood cancer research. The manipulation was so clumsy, I almost felt embarrassed for her. But it was Kevin who really showed the family's true colours when he grabbed the phone back. He didn't even pretend to care about reconciliation, just launched straight into how Harold's company was in trouble, how they'd lost 3 major contracts in the past year, how Brandon's father had made good on his threat to destroy their business relationships. They were $30 million in debt, he said, and without immediate investment, 500 employees would lose their jobs. Surely I wouldn't let that happen, he said, not when I had more money than I could ever spend. The admission hit me like cold water, clarifying everything in an instant. They didn't want me back. They wanted my money. The only thing that had changed between my unwelcome appearance at their door and these desperate phone calls was their knowledge of my net worth. I was still the same person they'd thrown away, just wrapped in a different package, now one that could solve their financial problems. The equation was so simple it was insulting my value as a daughter, directly proportional to my bank account balance. I told Harold I would call him tomorrow and hung up despite the protests and pleas from multiple voices on their end. The phone immediately started ringing again, but I turned it off and sat in the darkness of the conference room, watching the city count down to midnight through the windows. At exactly 12 a.m. fireworks exploded over the Hudson River, and I could hear cheering from the streets below, people celebrating new beginnings, while I sat alone processing the end of an old hope I hadn't even realized I'd still been carrying. Sarah called my office phone somehow, knowing I'd be there, and when I picked up, she didn't say anything at first, just stayed on the line, while I cried 3 years' worth of tears I'd been holding back. When I finally told her what had happened, she made a sound of disgust and said she was coming to get me. that I wasn't spending the first moments of my new year as a billionaire crying over people who didn't deserve me. By the time she arrived with a bottle of champagne and her husband in tow, I'd made a decision about exactly how to handle my family. The next morning, Harold showed up at my office building at 8 a.m. sharp, wearing his best suit and carrying a bouquet of roses that probably cost $200. Security called up to ask if they should let him in, and I could hear the confusion in their voice, since they'd been explicitly told for 3 years that Harold Harrison was never to be admitted. I told them to send him up, then asked Sarah to stay in the room as a witness to whatever was about to happen. When Harold walked into my office, he paused to take in the space, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the modern furniture, the wall of awards and recognition that had accumulated over 3 years. His expression was a mixture of pride and regret, though I suspected the regret was more about missing out on my success than about how he'd treated me. He sat down across from my desk, placing the flowers carefully on the surface, as if they were an offering at an altar. The speech he'd prepared was masterful in its manipulation, hitting every emotional button he thought might work. He talked about the difficulties of fatherhood, the pressure of providing for a family, the fear of losing everything he'd built. He actually teared up when talking about how proud he was of my achievements, how he'd followed my career in secret, how he'd wanted to reach out so many times but didn't know how. If I hadn't known the truth from Kevin's panicked admission the night before, I might have been moved by the performance. When he finally got to the ask, it was wrapped in so much false sentimentality that it was almost impressive. He suggested that investing in the family company would be a way to heal our relationship, that working together could bring us closer than ever before. He painted a picture of a dynasty, the Harrison name on buildings across the country, father and daughter united in business and life. All it would take was a small investment, maybe $40 million, to clear the debts and provide working capital pocket change for someone of my new wealth. I let him finish, then pulled out a document I'd had my lawyers prepare that morning. It was a check for $30 million, but not as an investment. It was structured as a payment to clear the company's debts with several ironclad conditions. First, Harold would have to step down as CEO, immediately allowing a professional management team to take over. Second, he would have to agree to never contact me again, neither him nor Patricia nor Kevin. Third, the payment would go directly to the creditors and employees' pension fund, not through Harold's hands. His face went through a spectacular range of colours as he read through the terms from red to white to an interesting shade of purple when he got to the no-contact clause. He started to argue, saying I couldn't be serious, that family meant more than money, that he'd rather lose the company than lose me. But we both knew that was a lie, and when I didn't budge, his true nature finally showed through completely. He called me vindictive, ungrateful, said I was punishing him for trying to secure my future with Brandon, that everything he'd done had been for my own good. The mask had finally slipped completely, and the man sitting across from me wasn't my father anymore, just a desperate businessman trying to salvage a deal. I told him he had 24 hours to accept the terms, or the offer would be withdrawn and the company could face bankruptcy on its own. I also informed him that Jennifer was excluded from the no-contact clause, as she'd reached out separately that morning with what seemed like genuine remorse rather than financial motivation. As security escorted him out, Harold turned at the door with one last attempt at manipulation, asking if I could really let 500 innocent employees suffer just to punish him. I reminded him that the payment would ensure all employees were taken care of, that only he would suffer from stepping down, and that he'd made his choice 3 years ago when he picked $50 million over his daughter. The last thing he said to me was that I'd become cold, that success had changed me. I told him he was wrong, that his rejection had changed me, and success had just freed me from needing his approval. The year that followed the acquisition was a masterclass in learning who really mattered in my life, and who had only been there for what they could gain from proximity to success. Harold took the deal, of course, signing the papers, with Patricia crying beside him as if they were signing away their souls, rather than accepting $30 million that would save their lifestyle and the jobs of hundreds of employees. The news of his stepping down made the business sections of several papers with speculation about health issues or family problems, but the truth never came out because I had no interest in public revenge. Within weeks of the deal closing, I established the Whitney Harrison Foundation with an initial endowment of $100 million focused on supporting women in technology and entrepreneurship who'd been told they didn't fit the mold. The irony of using the Harrison name for something Harold would have sneered at wasn't lost on me, but it felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me. The foundation's first grant went to a young woman from Bangladesh who'd been kicked out of her home for refusing an arranged marriage and was building an app to help women in similar situations find safe housing and legal resources. Sarah helped me find a penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side. Nothing ostentatious, but with enough space to finally breathe after years in cramped quarters. The first time I stood on the terrace, looking out over Central Park with a glass of wine that cost more than my old monthly rent, I waited to feel something triumphant or vindicated. Instead, I just felt tired, like I'd been running a marathon for 3 years and had finally crossed a finish line that turned out to be just another starting point. My employees became my chosen family in ways that went beyond corporate culture buzzwords. When Marcus, one of our lead developers, needed help with his daughter's medical bills, I didn't just write a check. I spent hours researching specialists and making calls to get her the best care possible. When our head of marketing got married, I didn't just attend the wedding, I gave a toast that had everyone in tears talking about how she'd believed in our vision when it was just PowerPoint slides and hope. These people had stood by me when I had nothing to offer but equity and exhausting hours, and now that I could give them more, it felt like completing a circle. Jennifer reached out tentatively at first, just a text asking if we could have coffee sometime. I agreed, meeting her at a small place near her hospital where we wouldn't be recognized or interrupted. She looked older, worn down in a way that suggested the past 3 years hadn't been as smooth as the family's social media suggested. Over lattes that grew cold while we talked, she admitted that watching our parents turn on me had changed something fundamental in how she saw them, made her realize that their love came with terms and conditions she'd never noticed because she'd never challenged them. The conversation led to monthly dinners, then weekly phone calls, then Jennifer becoming a regular presence in my life again. She never asked for money, never brought up her research project again after that first desperate phone call, and slowly we built something new between us. Not the relationship we'd had as sisters growing up, but something more honest based on who we'd become rather than who we'd been expected to be. When she finally told me that Harold and Patricia had tried to pressure her into convincing me to give them more money and she'd refused, I knew we'd found our way to being real sisters. Kevin, on the other hand, found creative ways to violate the no-contact agreement without technically breaking it. Messages would come through mutual acquaintances, always with some variation of how he'd had no choice but to support our parents, how he was trapped by circumstances, how if I could just understand his position, I'd see he'd been a victim too. I ignored them all, recognizing the same deflection of responsibility that had always characterized Kevin's approach to life. He'd made his choices, and unlike Jennifer, he was still making them. The work at MedTech Global consumed me in the best possible way, expanding our AI capabilities beyond what I'd dreamed possible with unlimited resources. We launched initiatives in developing countries where early disease detection could mean the difference between life and death for millions who'd never had access to advanced medical technology. Every success felt like proof that I'd been right to choose my own path, that the work mattered more than the approval of people who could only see value in traditional achievements. But it was the quiet moments that really marked my transformation, the times when I'd catch myself not thinking about my family for days at a time, then realize the absence of that pain without feeling guilty about it. I started dating again, carefully at first, with men who knew nothing about my wealth until I trusted them enough to share that part of my story. Some couldn't handle it, intimidated or greedy in ways that reminded me too much of Brandon. But eventually, I met Daniel, a professor of bioethics, who challenged me intellectually and couldn't have cared less about my bank account. Patricia tried to break the no-contact agreement once showing up at a charity gala she knew I'd be attending. She approached me during cocktail hour, looking elegant in a dress I recognized as new and expensive, probably purchased with the money that had saved them from bankruptcy. She started to speak something about forgiveness and time healing all wounds, but I simply turned and walked away, feeling nothing but a mild annoyance that she'd interrupted my conversation with a fascinating researcher from Japan. The power she'd once held over me had evaporated completely. The second New Year's Eve after the acquisition, I hosted a party of my own, filling my apartment with the people who'd become my real family. Sarah was there with her family, my employees and their partners, Jennifer with her new boyfriend, who looked at her like she hung the moon, and Daniel, who'd spent the day helping me cook enough food for 50 people while debating the ethics of AI in medicine. As midnight approached, I stood on the terrace with these people who'd chosen to be in my life without conditions or expectations, and I felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with the numbers in my bank account. Someone asked me to make a toast, and as I raised my champagne glass, I found myself thinking about that night. 3 years ago, when I'd stood outside my parents' house, shaking with cold and rejection. That woman felt like a stranger, now someone who'd needed validation from people incapable of giving it unconditionally. I'd thought success would be the best revenge, but I'd learned something better. Success was just success, but freedom from needing revenge at all, that was the real victory. Looking around at the faces of people who loved me for who I was, rather than what I could provide, I realized that Harold had been wrong about success changing me. Success had simply revealed what had always been true, that real family isn't about blood or obligation or traditional expectations. It's about the people who see you clearly and choose to stay, who celebrate your victories without calculating what they might gain, who show up not because they have to, but because they want to. The Harrisons had taught me what family wasn't, and in doing so, they'd freed me to discover what it could be. I'd thought losing my family was the price of choosing myself, but I'd learned it wasn't a loss at all. It was an exchange trading conditional love for unconditional support, trading the weight of expectation for the lightness of authenticity. And as the clock struck midnight and fireworks exploded over Manhattan, surrounded by people who'd never asked me to be anything other than exactly who I was, I knew I'd gotten the better end of the deal. The $1 billion was nice, but the freedom to live without apology or explanation, to define success and family on my own terms, that was priceless. The money had been the catalyst for revealing truth, but the real transformation had happened in those 3 years of rejection and struggle, when I'd learnt to build something from nothing but determination and refused to let anyone's dismissal define my worth. Harold's call after learning about my wealth had told me everything I needed to know about the family I'd lost, but more importantly, it had confirmed everything I'd gained by walking away. Some prices are too high to pay even for belonging, and some freedoms are too precious to trade even for acceptance. So when people ask me now about becoming a billionaire overnight, I tell them the money was actually the least interesting part of the story. The real overnight transformation had happened 3 years earlier, when I'd said no to a life that would have killed everything unique about me, and yes to the uncertainty of defining success for myself. The $1 billion just made it impossible for anyone to argue with my definition anymore. And that call from Harold, desperate and calculating, had been the perfect punctuation mark on a chapter that needed to end for the real story of my life to begin. What would you do if your family's love came with a price tag you couldn't afford to pay, not in money, but in authenticity? Would you have the courage to walk away from everything familiar for the chance to discover who you really are? I learned that sometimes the most expensive thing you can do is stay where you're not valued, and the most profitable investment you can make is in becoming exactly who you're meant to be, even if that means doing it alone. Thank you all for listening to my story tonight. If you've ever felt like the black sheep of your family, remember that sometimes being different isn't a flaw to be fixed, but a gift to be celebrated. Please share this with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by their family's approval. Like this video, if you believe in choosing yourself, subscribe for more stories of triumph over rejection, and comment below with your own experiences of breaking free from expectations. What was your moment of choosing authenticity over approval? I'd love to hear your stories. And to everyone starting a new year feeling alone or rejected, remember that your real family might still be out there waiting to find you. And success isn't about proving others wrong, but about proving yourself right. Happy New Year! And may this be the year you finally give yourself permission to shine exactly as bright as you are meant to.